The artillery shell hit without warning. Not a whistle of warning, not a half-second of silence before impact. Just the world splitting open in a roar of fire, shattered earth, and steel fragments moving at the speed of lightning. The trench walls shook. Men flattened themselves against the mud. Dirt and smoke and the smell of burning wood rained down from above. And in the middle of all of it, in the churning chaos of one of the worst artillery barrages of the Western Front, a small figure crouched in the mud and began, methodically, deliberately, with a kind of terrible focus, picking up stones, one by one, placing them carefully, building a wall. He could not have been more than 3 feet tall. He wore a khaki uniform with brass buttons polished bright as the sun. A regimental cap sat on his head. His hands, dark, leathery, precise, moved with a calm that no human soldier around him could manage. The bombardment had reduced grown men to trembling heaps. It had shattered the nerves of veterans who had survived 3 years of war. But this creature, this impossible, improbable soldier, was trying to build himself a fortress out of rubble, stone by stone, in the middle of hell. His name was Jackie. He held the rank of corporal in the 3rd South African Infantry Regiment. And in April of 1918, on the blood-soaked slopes of Kemmel Hill in Belgium, he was about to give the world a lesson in courage that no textbook had ever imagined. What you are about to hear is not a metaphor. It is not a feel-good story invented to soften the horror of the Great War. Every word of it is documented, verified, witnessed by hundreds of men who stood beside him, fought beside him, and wept when they thought he might not survive. This is the story of Jackie, the corporal of the Argonne, the baboon who went to war, earned his uniform, and refused to let the guns break him. To understand how a baboon ended up in the trenches of France, you have to go back to a farm in the Transvaal in the years before the world decided to tear itself apart. South Africa, in the early years of the 20th century, was a land still raw from its own war, the bitter, grinding conflict between the British Empire and the Boer republics that had ended in 1902 and left scars that would take a generation to fade. The farms of the Transvaal were places of hard work and close living, where the boundary between wild nature and domestic life was thinner than it looked on a map. Animals were not pets in the way city people understood the word. They were companions in a deeper and older sense, creatures who shared the daily rhythms of labor and rest, who recognized faces and voices, who learned the patterns of a household, and wove themselves into the fabric of it. Albert Marr was a young farmer, a son of the Transvaal, a man who had grown up knowing the veld the way other people know the streets of their hometown. He was not a large man, not a man given to drama or sentiment, but he had the quality that defines the best kind of people in any era. He noticed things, and what he noticed one day in the vicinity of his family farm was a young chacma baboon, Papio ursinus, the species that ranges across southern Africa from the Cape to the Limpopo, who had become separated from his troop and was getting himself into exactly the kind of trouble that young animals without supervision reliably find. Albert could have left him. He could have shooed him away. Instead, he brought him home. He named him Jackie, and from that first evening, something unusual happened. Jackie did not behave like a wild animal in captivity. He did not pace or rage or scratch at walls. He settled. He watched. He learned. He began, with a patience and an intelligence that astonished everyone who saw it, to fit himself into the world of the farm. He ate at the table. He helped with small chores. He followed Albert everywhere with a devotion that went beyond training or conditioning, and became, over time, something that both of them would have recognized as friendship if either of them had had the vocabulary for it. Then the summer of 1914 arrived, and with it the news that the world's great empires had decided to go to war. South Africa, as a dominion of the British Crown, found itself pulled into the conflict almost immediately. Young men from the farms and towns of the Transvaal, the Cape, Natal, began enlisting. Albert Marr enlisted with the 3rd South African Infantry Regiment, part of what would become the 1st South African Infantry Brigade, one of the finest units the Dominion would send overseas. And when he packed his kit and prepared to leave the farm, he faced a question that any man with his particular situation would have faced: what to do with Jackie? The answer in retrospect seems as inevitable as anything in this story. He took him along. This decision was not as straightforwardly permitted as it might sound. Military regulations regarding mascots and unofficial animals attached to units were a patchwork of tradition, local interpretation, and the personal tolerance of individual commanding officers. Some units had dogs, some had cats. The 3rd South African Infantry Regiment would have a baboon. The regiment's officers, when confronted with Jackie for the first time, reportedly responded with a range of reactions from amusement to deep skepticism. A baboon is not a small animal. A fully grown chacma baboon can weigh 40 pounds, possesses a bite force that can shatter bone, and is capable of screaming loud enough to be heard across a battlefield. He is also, as officers would quickly discover, intelligent enough to understand that there are rules and that breaking them has consequences, and to weigh those consequences with something very close to human calculation. What won them over, in the end, was not Jackie's charm, though he had that. It was his behavior under pressure. The regiment trained first in South Africa, then shipped out to Egypt, where the British were dealing with a threat from the Senussi, the Islamic Brotherhood of the Libyan desert, who had allied themselves with the Ottoman Empire and were raiding across the Egyptian frontier. The desert was nothing like the Transvaal. The heat was different, the terrain was different, the sounds and smells were different. Men who had spent their lives under the open sky of southern Africa found themselves in a landscape of dunes and flies and heat mirages. Jackie, to the astonishment of everyone watching, adapted faster than almost any of them. He had always been alert. In the desert, his alertness became a tactical asset. He could hear and smell things that no human soldier detected until minutes later. He would go rigid, his gaze fixed on a distant point, and growl in a specific low register that the men around him quickly learned to interpret as a warning. German patrol, enemy movement, something in the dark, more than once. In those desert operations, Jackie's early warning gave the unit time to prepare an ambush or take cover before an enemy patrol arrived. It was not coincidence. It was not luck. It was the result of sensory capabilities that evolution had spent millions of years refining for exactly this kind of environment. Detecting predators, spotting movement, reading the wind. The men of the 3rd Regiment stopped thinking of Jackie as a mascot and started thinking of him as something harder to name. A colleague, a comrade, someone who pulled his weight. If you are wondering whether this sounds too convenient, too neat, too much like the kind of story that gets improved in the retelling, consider what the historical record shows. Jackie was not the only animal serving in an official or semi-official capacity during the First World War. The conflict involved millions of horses, hundreds of thousands of carrier pigeons, dogs trained as messengers and sentinels, even a bear named Wojtek, who would achieve fame in the Second World War with the Polish Army. But Jackie was unusual, not merely because of his species, but because of the depth of his integration into military structure. He was not kept on a leash in the rear. He was issued an official service number. He had a military ration book. He was paid. A daily ration allocation was listed in his name. The regimental tailor sewed him a khaki uniform to match the men. Complete with the regimental buttons, he wore a service cap. These details matter not as quaint anecdotes, but as evidence that the regiment had made a collective decision at every level of command to treat this animal as a soldier. That decision reflected something real about what Jackie actually did and who Jackie actually was. The regiment's deployment shifted from Egypt to France as the war's center of gravity moved back to the Western Front in 1916 and 1917. The Somme, the Ancre, the grinding, blood-soaked campaigns that consumed the lives of young men by the hundreds of thousands. The 1st South African Infantry Brigade fought at Delville Wood in July and August of 1916. A battle so savage, so concentrated, so relentless in its destruction that the South African National Memorial there still stands as one of the most solemn places on the former Western Front. Jackie was there. He was in the trenches throughout the Somme campaign. And what the trenches did to the men around him is worth understanding before you can understand what they meant for a creature of Jackie's nature. A chacma baboon in the wild is a troop animal. He lives in a community of 30, 50, sometimes 100 individuals, each with a role, each with a social position, each embedded in a web of relationships that provides the basic psychological framework of survival. Take that animal and place him in a trench where the social group is a company of human soldiers, where the landscape is mud and barbed wire, and the bodies of men who did not survive, where the sounds are not birdsong and wind, but the constant, unending percussion of artillery. And you might expect psychological collapse. You might expect an animal driven to madness by overstimulation and fear. That is not what happened with Jackie. What happened was the opposite. Jackie adapted to the trench the way he had adapted to Albert Marr's farm, the way he had adapted to the Egyptian desert, by reading his social environment, identifying the structure, and inserting himself into it. The trench, with its rigid hierarchy of officers and NCOs and enlisted men, its routines of watch and stand to and ration distribution, its rituals of maintenance and repair, was not so different from the social hierarchy of a baboon troop. There was an alpha. There were subordinates. There were rules. Jackie understood all of it. He respected rank. He saluted officers, a gesture he had apparently learned by observation, and that he performed with a precision that made grown men laugh. In situations where laughter was the rarest and most precious commodity imaginable. This is the moment in Jackie's story where you need to decide how much weight to give to a word: courage. We use that word carefully, or we should. Courage, in its fullest sense, implies the awareness of danger and the decision to face it anyway. A conscious choice made in the shadow of fear. Whether a baboon experiences something we can legitimately call fear in the way humans do is a question that behavioral science has been wrestling with for decades. What we can say is this: Jackie knew the trenches were dangerous. The behavioral evidence is unambiguous. He reacted to incoming artillery with the same physical startle response as the men around him. He flinched. He sought cover. He pressed himself against the trench wall when shells fell close. He was not oblivious to the danger the way a very simple animal might be. He registered it. He processed it, and then again and again he stayed. He stayed with Albert. He stayed with the regiment. He performed his duties as a sentry. He gave his warnings. He helped the wounded, bringing them water, climbing over the mud to reach men who had fallen, staying close to the men who shook with shell shock while they rode out their private storms. The regimental records, the memoirs of soldiers who served alongside him, the press accounts from correspondents who visited the unit, all of them described the same thing. Jackie was not merely tolerated. He was relied upon. He was, in the language the men used, one of them. The nights in the trenches were, in some ways, worse than the days. During the day, you could see. You could identify the source of danger. At night, the darkness of the Western Front was absolute in a way that modern people rarely experience. No artificial light, no ambient glow from cities, just the blackness of a Belgian or French night, punctuated by the flashes of artillery and the white burst of very lights fired to illuminate no man's land. German raiding parties moved in that darkness. They slipped through the wire in small groups, intent on capturing prisoners for intelligence or simply on causing enough chaos to unsettle the defense. Detecting them before they were inside the wire was the difference between a contained incident and a catastrophe. Jackie detected them. His hearing could pick up footfalls in the mud 100 yards away. His nose could catch the smell of German leather, German food, German bodies, through the fog and the mud and the cordite. When he caught that scent or that sound, he would growl, a specific low, continuous sound that the sentries around him had learned to distinguish from his other vocalizations. It was never wrong. Not once, in 3 years on the Western Front, did Jackie give a false alarm. Not once did he miss a genuine one. The officers who had been skeptical at the beginning were not skeptical anymore. They had fought alongside Jackie long enough to understand that whatever he was, whatever category you put him in, he was doing something that mattered. He was keeping men alive. There is a particular quality of intimacy that develops between people under extreme stress, and it extends, the historical record makes this abundantly clear, to the animals who share that stress with them. The bond between Albert Marr and Jackie was not new by the time they reached France. It had been forming since that first day on the Transvaal farm, deepening through years of shared daily life. But war accelerated and intensified it in ways that peacetime never could. Albert knew Jackie's sounds the way he knew his own heartbeat. Jackie knew Albert's moods, his fears, the particular way he moved when he was frightened versus when he was simply exhausted. They slept near each other. They ate together. When the bombardment was bad and the world was coming apart around them, they were often found pressed against the same section of trench wall, not speaking, not making any sound, simply being close. Men who survived the Great War talked sometimes about the relationships that had sustained them through it, the friendships formed under fire, the bonds that no peacetime relationship could fully replicate. Albert Marr rarely spoke publicly about what Jackie meant to him. He did not need to. The fact that he had brought him from a Transvaal farm to the mud of Belgium and kept him there through 3 years of the worst war in human history said everything. If you have ever had an animal who you knew, truly knew in the way you know a person, then you understand something of what that relationship looked like. If you have not, I am not sure I can explain it in a way that will satisfy you. Some things only make sense from the inside. There were moments of lightness, even in the trenches. This is something the histories of the Great War do not always adequately convey. The way that human beings, and apparently baboons, find pockets of ordinary life even in the middle of extraordinary horror. Jackie was a source of laughter in situations where laughter required real effort to find. He had opinions about food, strongly held and freely expressed. He developed what can only be described as a personal beef with certain officers whose faces or posture or smell he apparently found objectionable, and he expressed this displeasure in the uninhibited way of his species, with a directness that no private soldier could have gotten away with. He stole things, rations, small items of equipment, pieces of clothing, with a methodical efficiency that suggested genuine planning rather than mere opportunism. He was caught, scolded, and forgiven again and again because the men who caught him could not manage to stay angry at him for longer than it took him to look at them with those large, dark, expressive eyes. He was also capable of extraordinary gentleness. With the men who were breaking, the ones whose hands would not stop shaking, whose eyes had gone empty in the way that the medical officers called shell shock, Jackie had a specific behavior. He would move close. He would sit beside them. He would place his hand on their arm and stay there. Not performing comfort, not doing anything trained, just being present, with a warmth and a steadiness that the men around him had long since been depleted of. The medical officers noticed this. It was not accidental. Jackie was responding to something real in those men, something he recognized: distress, withdrawal, the particular stillness of a creature who has stopped trying to cope, and responding to it with the social instinct of a highly intelligent primate who had learned over years of living among humans what it meant to need comfort. By the spring of 1918, the war had reached its most desperate phase. Germany, freed from the two-front war by Russia's collapse following the revolution, had transferred dozens of divisions from the east to the Western Front. General Ludendorff had devised the Great Offensive, Operation Michael, and its successors, that was intended to break the Allied line before American troops could arrive in sufficient numbers to shift the balance permanently. The offensive struck in March 1918 with a ferocity that stunned the Allies. The British Fifth Army nearly collapsed. Ground that had been held for years was lost in days. The line bent and shook and in some places broke, and for several terrible weeks it was not clear that it would hold at all. The South African Brigade was thrown into some of the hardest fighting of these weeks in the sector around Kemmel Hill in Belgium's West Flanders, a piece of high ground whose tactical importance made it one of the most violently contested positions on the entire front. Artillery from both sides fell on Kemmel Hill and the surrounding trenches in densities that veterans of the Somme said exceeded anything they had experienced in 1916. The ground was churned to a consistency somewhere between mud and soup. The air smelled of chemicals and decay. Men fought and died and fought again, and the small piece of earth changed hands multiple times in the space of days. It was here, in the second week of April in 1918, that Jackie's story reached its crisis. The German bombardment that morning was not unusual by the standards of what had become usual, which is to say, it was appalling by any peacetime measure, a rolling curtain of high explosive and shrapnel that walked methodically up and down the Allied positions, pulverizing men and earth with a thoroughness that suggested not anger but engineering. Shells of 150 millimeters, the heavy artillery, fall with a different quality than smaller calibers. The sound is lower, deeper, felt in the chest as much as heard with the ears. The explosion throws earth and steel across a wider radius. The fragments have a velocity and a mass that defeat most improvised cover. A man in a shallow trench near a direct hit is not wounded in any ordinary sense. He is unmade. Jackie was in the trench when one of these shells landed close. The fragments did what fragments do. They spread outward from the point of impact in a pattern that was indifferent to species, to rank, to 3 years of faithful service, to everything. One of them found Jackie. It struck his left rear leg just below the knee with a force that nearly severed it. The bone was shattered. The tissue was torn. It was the kind of wound that, in a human soldier, would have meant a stretcher and morphine and evacuation as fast as the system could manage. Jackie did not go down. This is the part of the story that I need you to sit with for a moment, because it is the part that strips everything down to something essential. He was hit. He felt it. The behavioral evidence is clear. He reacted to the wound with an immediate and obvious response. And then, and this is what the men who saw it reported, what ended up in the regiment's after-action accounts, what made it into the dispatches that reached South Africa months later. He began to build a wall in the ruins of the trench around him, among the fallen timber and the shattered sandbags and the loose stones that an artillery barrage always leaves in its wake. Jackie began picking up pieces of masonry, fragments of brick, and stacking them around himself, on 3 legs, under continued bombardment, with systematic deliberateness, as if the thing he was doing was not extraordinary, but simply necessary. Was this the instinct of a wounded animal seeking shelter? Was it something more than instinct, a response shaped by 3 years of watching soldiers build cover, of understanding that stone protects, and that protection is worth building even when it hurts to build it? The men who saw it could not agree on the answer, but they agreed on what they saw. And what they saw stopped them, even in that bombardment, even in the chaos. They stopped and watched a 3-foot-tall baboon build himself a fort out of rubble, and none of them forgot it for the rest of their lives. The medical officers reached Jackie when the intensity of the bombardment eased enough to allow movement. And here the story acquires another layer that you will not find in accounts of most soldiers. Jackie, when they came to him, did not want to go. He was not done. Whatever he was doing with those stones, he was not finished. And he resisted the men who tried to lift him with the focused, purposeful resistance of a creature who has somewhere to be. It took Albert Marr's voice, Albert crouching beside him, speaking to him in the low, specific tones that Jackie had known since puppyhood, to get him to stop, to let himself be lifted, to allow the medical team to assess what had happened to his leg. What they found was bad. The wound was severe enough that amputation was the only viable option. They performed the surgery in a field medical station under chloroform, and the medical officers noted in their reports that they were not certain his heart would sustain the anesthetic. He was not a young animal at this point. 3 years of frontline service in some of the most hellish conditions in human history had taken a physical toll, as they take a toll on everything. But Jackie's heart held. He came through the surgery. He woke up with 1 fewer leg than he had gone in with, and when he was sufficiently recovered from the anesthetic to know where he was, the first thing he apparently did was look for Albert. He found him. They stayed close together through the recovery period that followed, and something about those days, the 2 of them, in a rear area facility, away from the guns for the first time in months, is worth imagining, even if no one recorded it in detail. What do you say to the creature who has been beside you through 3 years of the worst thing you have ever survived? You probably do not say anything. You probably just stay close, and that is enough. When Jackie had recovered sufficiently from his surgery to be upright on 3 legs, the regiment discovered something that became one of the most widely reported anecdotes of the entire war. Jackie could still salute. He had always saluted officers. It was one of his most noted behaviors. This precise raising of the right hand to the forehead in the military manner, performed when officers of sufficient rank were present and apparently discriminated with reasonable accuracy between those who outranked the men around him and those who did not. After the amputation, with 3 legs instead of 4, the habit did not go away. He was seen standing to attention on a single hind leg, balancing with the concentrated effort of an animal who has had to renegotiate its relationship with gravity, and bringing his right hand up to his forehead in the manner he had always used. The officers he saluted reportedly did not know whether to laugh or cry, and several of them did both. It is easy to dismiss this as a charming trick. It is harder to dismiss it if you consider what it represents. Jackie had learned the salute not as a conditioned behavior produced by rewards, but as a social behavior, an acknowledgement of hierarchy and relationship, performed because the social structure of which he was part used it as a communicative gesture. He performed it after losing a leg because losing a leg had not changed who he was or where he stood in that structure. He was still a soldier of the 3rd South African Infantry Regiment. He still knew his place in the hierarchy and respected it. He still understood that some things you do regardless of what it costs you. The story reached back to South Africa faster than most war news traveled in those pre-broadcast days, carried by the informal networks of letters and returned soldiers that kept the home front, connected to the front. Jackie had been mentioned in dispatches before. The regimental accounts that became part of the public record included references to his service that had filtered through to newspapers in Johannesburg and Cape Town. But the story of his wounding and survival struck a deeper chord at a moment when South Africa was exhausted by 4 years of sending its young men into the European killing machine and receiving back the ones it received back in various states of incompleteness. He became a symbol, not of the empire, not of the cause, not of any political or ideological framework. He became a symbol of something simpler and harder to argue with, of loyalty that does not count the cost, of courage that does not require a reason, of the bond between a creature and the company it keeps that persists through everything that ought to sever it. The newspapers found this irresistible, and so did the public. And so, it must be said, did the military establishment, which was not above, recognizing that a 3-legged baboon who still stood at attention was good for morale both at the front and at home. Jackie was formally promoted, before the end of the war, to the rank of corporal. His promotion ceremony was conducted with the same formality applied to the promotion of human soldiers. He received his stripes. He wore them. The regiment was pleased. Jackie's response to the ceremony was not recorded, but one imagines it was characteristic. The armistice came in November 1918, and with it, the long, complicated process of unwinding 4 years of the most industrialized destruction the world had yet produced. Units were demobilized. Men were sent home. The landscape of Belgium and France, churned, poisoned, cratered beyond recognition, began the slow, century-long process of forgetting what had happened to it. The 3rd South African Infantry Regiment was prepared for repatriation, and the question of what to do with Jackie was not actually a question at all. He was going home with them. He was going home with Albert. He had been in service since 1915. He had fought in Egypt and France and Belgium. He had been wounded in action. He had been promoted. He was a veteran, and veterans go home. The ship that carried the regiment back to South Africa carried Jackie too, and when they arrived, the welcome that the country gave to its returning soldiers extended with a warmth that tells you something about what the years of separation had cost people to its returning baboon. Jackie was brought to Pretoria. He was presented to the public. He was photographed in his uniform. He received a pension, an actual documented financial allowance, from the South African government, recognizing his service in terms that the pension board apparently felt no need to hedge with excessive legal qualification. Albert Marr returned to the Transvaal. Jackie went with him. They went back to the life they had had before the war, back to the farm, back to the rhythms of the veld that had formed them both before the world intervened and demanded something extraordinary of them. Jackie lived for the rest of his life on or near Albert's property, living out the years of his retirement in the company of the man he had followed to war and back. He died in 1921, 3 years after the armistice. He was not old by the standards of his species. Chacma baboons in good conditions can live 20 or 30 years, but he had not lived in good conditions. He had lived in conditions that taxed every system of his body for years, and the cumulative weight of that experience shortened whatever life he might otherwise have had. He died as he had lived, with Albert nearby. He was buried on the farm. The inscription on his grave marker did not use the word mascot. It used the word soldier, because that is what he was. The South African military, in the decades since, has not forgotten Jackie. His story appears in regimental histories, in national, military archives, in museum collections that preserve his photographs and documents. The uniform he wore, or a version of it, the regimental tailoring that made him officially, visibly one of the unit, survived and has been displayed. His service record survived. The documentation of his rank, his rations, his wound, his promotion, all of it is in the archives, available to anyone who wants to read it, real and verifiable, and stubbornly refusing to be reduced to the status of legend. This matters, in a way that goes beyond historical accuracy. We live in an age saturated with stories that are designed to make us feel a certain way, stories engineered with the precision of pharmaceuticals to produce a specific emotional response and then dissolve without residue. Jackie's story is not like that. It is not designed. It is not engineered. It is simply what happened, documented by people who had no interest in making it mythological, who wrote it down because it was true and because the truth of it seemed worth preserving. What you do with it, what emotional or philosophical freight you choose to attach to it, is your business. But the story itself will not be improved by embellishment, because the story itself is already more than you need. What Jackie's story asks of us, if we are willing to let it ask anything, is a question about what we mean when we talk about courage, loyalty, and the nature of the bonds that form between living creatures under pressure. We tend to tell stories about these qualities in ways that center on human experience, on conscious moral choice, on the decision to do the right thing at personal cost. Jackie complicates that framework in a productive way. He did not choose to go to war in the sense that Albert chose, weighing options and deciding between them with the deliberative apparatus of adult human reason. He went because Albert went. He stayed because Albert stayed. He performed his duties not because he had reflected on the meaning of duty, but because the social structure of which he was part required certain behaviors, and he had the intelligence and the social awareness to understand and fulfill them. And yet the result, 3 years of reliable sentinel work, of early warnings that saved lives, of emotional support that sustained men through ordeals they could not otherwise have survived, of a dignity and a composure under fire that shamed no one and inspired many. This result is indistinguishable, functionally, from what we call courage and loyalty in human soldiers. Maybe the distinction we draw between conscious courage and instinctive loyalty is not as clean as we would like it to be. Maybe what we are really recognizing, in both human and animal, is the fact of showing up, of being present, of fulfilling the role you have taken on, of not abandoning the ones you belong to when the cost of staying is high. Jackie showed up. Every day in the mud and the gas and the shells, he showed up. That is what the uniform meant. That is what the salute meant. That is what the promotion meant, and the pension and the grave marker that called him soldier instead of pet. Yeah, we need these stories now, maybe more than ever. Not because they are easy or comfortable, they are neither, but because they carry a truth that resists the tendency to sort everything into the categories of useful and useless, sentient and non-sentient, worthy and unworthy of consideration. Jackie was not useful to the 3rd South African Infantry Regiment in the way that a piece of equipment is useful. He was not a tool. He was a presence. He was a relationship. He was the living proof of something that the trenches tried very hard to destroy in every man who passed through them. The conviction that there is something worth protecting, something worth staying for, something worth standing at attention for, even on 3 legs. If that conviction survived in the hearts of men who had seen each other, and then told their children each other, and then told their children and their grandchildren, were stories about a baboon in a khaki uniform who never stopped being what he was, alert, loyal, present, irreducible, no matter what the war threw at him. If you have stayed with this story all the way to here, you know something now that most people do not know. You know about the Kemmel Hill bombardment and the Wall of Stones. You know about the surgery under chloroform and the heart that held. You know about the one-legged salute and the corporal's stripes and the pension and the grave. You know that there was once a baboon named Jackie who went to war because the man he loved went to war, and who came home because the man he loved came home, and who spent whatever years he had left on the farm in the Transvaal under the African sky that had been the beginning of all of it. That knowledge belongs to you now. What you do with it is your choice. But I will tell you what I think, for whatever it is worth. I think the fact that we can still be moved by this story, a century after the events it describes, is not a small thing. I think the fact that a baboon's courage can still stop us in our tracks, can still make us reconsider what we think we know about the creatures we share this world with and the bonds that form between us in extremity, is evidence of something important about what we are and what we are still capable of becoming. Jackie is gone. Albert is gone. The regiment is part of history. The trenches of Belgium have been grassed over and planted with poppies. But this story is still here. It still works. It still does what stories are supposed to do, which is to crack open the ordinary and show you that the world is stranger and richer and more full of grace than the news would have you believe. Leave a comment below if this story hit you the way it hit me. Share it with someone who needs it. And if you are not subscribed yet, this is the moment, because there are 100 more stories like this one waiting. Stories of impossible courage in impossible circumstances. Stories that the history books left out and that someone has to tell. I am going to keep telling them. I hope you keep listening.